Elias, a man shrouded in the quiet grief of a life irrevocably altered, moved through the world like a ghost, his existence defined by absence. A reclusive sound engineer by trade, his days were spent meticulously dissecting audio, searching for imperfections, yet never truly finding solace. The constant hum of his equipment often served as a fragile barrier against the deafening silence left by a past tragedy, the loss of a loved one that had fractured his very being. He sought refuge in the precise, controllable world of sound waves, a stark contrast to the chaotic, untamable sorrow that resided within him. Then came the letter, an unexpected summons from a distant relative, informing him of an inheritance, an old, dilapidated apartment. It was a property he had never known existed, a forgotten relic tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. Elias saw it not as a burden, but as a potential sanctuary, a neutral ground where he might finally outrun the echoes of his own grief and perhaps, just perhaps, find a semblance of a fresh start. The prospect, however faint, stirred a flicker of hope in his otherwise desolate heart. Stepping across the threshold for the first time, a profound sense of unease immediately enveloped him. The air was thick, heavy with the dust of decades, and an indescribable stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The apartment's acoustics were peculiar. Sounds seemed to linger, to stretch and distort in unnerving ways, creating a disorienting resonance that made the space feel alive, yet strangely vacant. It was as if the very walls held a lingering presence, a silent audience to unknown dramas. In a forgotten corner of what must have been a study, Elias stumbled upon a collection of antique recording equipment, cumbersome reel-to-reel machines, delicate microphones with tarnished grills, and a dusty box overflowing with unlabeled tapes. His engineer's instinct, long dormant, crackled to life. There was a morbid fascination in these forgotten relics, a professional curiosity that momentarily eclipsed his personal despair. He began to tinker, carefully examining the delicate mechanisms, the familiar tactile sensation of cold metal and aged wires a welcome distraction. As he coaxed one of the ancient reel-to-reel players back to life, a faint, distorted whisper emerged from the crackling speakers. It was barely audible, a ghostly murmur that seemed to weave itself into the ambient hum of the apartment. Elias initially dismissed it, attributing the anomaly to static, faulty wiring, or simply the capriciousness of such old machinery. Yet as he continued his work, the whispers persisted, growing in subtle intensity. One particular voice, melancholic and haunting, began to stand out from the amorphous background noise, hinting at a forgotten secret, a sorrowful tale yearning to be heard. Driven by an inexplicable, almost desperate curiosity, Elias started to meticulously repair the old devices, cleaning every component, replacing frayed cables, and calibrating the delicate heads. He spent days immersed in this mechanical resurrection, his reclusive nature finding comfort in the solitary pursuit. As the equipment slowly yielded to his skilled hands, the faint voices from the tapes and indeed from the apartment itself began to clear. They were no longer mere static, but fragments of conversations, snippets of lives lived long ago within these very walls. A chilling realization slowly dawned upon him. The apartment itself was a giant, sentient recording device, a silent witness that had captured and preserved the echoes of its past inhabitants. Every argument, every laugh, every hushed confession had been imprinted onto its very fabric, now playing back through the resurrected machinery. The implications were staggering, unsettling. Then, amidst the growing clarity of these spectral dialogues, a specific voice emerged, sending a jolt through Elias's carefully constructed detachment. It was eerily familiar, stirring a suppressed memory, a recognition that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The familiar voice, a phantom whisper from an unknown past, became Elias's relentless obsession, pulling him deeper into the apartment's enigmatic embrace. He dedicated himself entirely to deciphering the cacophony of sound. Each faint utterance a thread in a complex tapestry he was determined to unravel. Sleep became a luxury, meals an afterthought, as he spent countless hours hunched over the revitalized recording equipment, meticulously isolating, amplifying, and piecing together the fragmented dialogues. He discovered recurring sonic signatures, distinct voices that began to form characters in this spectral drama. A young couple, their tones oscillating between tender endearments and sharp disagreements. A stern landlord, his voice a low rumble of authority and complaint, and a mysterious visitor whose infrequent appearances were always preceded by a subtle shift in the apartment's atmospheric pressure. A strange tension in the air. These disembodied voices, initially just auditory anomalies, slowly began to paint a vivid, intricate picture. Elias heard snippets of laughter, hushed confessions, passionate declarations, and bitter accusations. He meticulously logged every discernible word, every sigh, every creak of a floorboard, creating a sprawling web of interconnected events. The apartment, through its ghostly inhabitants, started to narrate a story of profound emotional depth. A tale of burgeoning love, the slow creep of betrayal, and an escalating tension that permeated every corner of the dwelling. Driven by an insatiable need for context, Elias began to cross-reference the few names and dates sporadically mentioned in the clearer recordings with historical records. He spent days in dusty archives, sifting through old newspapers, property deeds, and census records, searching for tangible links to his spectral cast. Slowly, painstakingly, a particular narrative emerged from the digital static and faded ink. A passionate but ultimately doomed romance, unfolding within these very walls, destined for a tragic end. The echoes now had names, faces, and a timeline. As he delved deeper, Elias felt an increasingly profound, almost spiritual connection to these long-gone residents. Their emotions, raw and unedited, seemed to resonate deeply within his own soul, stirring dormant feelings he thought long buried. He heard the young couple's dreams, their whispered hopes for a future together, only to then encounter the chilling implications of a hidden affair, hinted at through furtive conversations and sudden, unexplained absences. The stern landlord's voice became more agitated, speaking of mounting debts and an impending financial crisis that threatened to engulf the apartment's inhabitants. The mysterious visitor's presence grew more frequent, his words laced with a subtle menace, his intentions shrouded in ambiguity. The recordings progressed towards an inevitable, horrifying climax. Elias could sense the approaching tragedy, the air in the apartment growing heavy with an unbearable dread. He heard fragments of a violent confrontation, raised voices, a sudden crash, but the crucial moments, the definitive sounds of the tragedy itself, were always maddeningly muffled, obscured by static, or abruptly cut off, as if the apartment itself recoiled from recording the ultimate violation. This incompleteness only fueled his desperation, his need to know, to understand the precise nature of the event that had scarred this space so profoundly. The lines between past and present began to blur. Elias experienced vivid dreams, waking visions that felt less like hallucinations and more like memories he hadn't lived. He saw the young couple, vibrant and alive, then shadowed by the looming figure of the mysterious visitor. He felt the rising panic, the crushing despair that had once filled these rooms. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant, an unwitting witness to a history he was compelled to exhume. Then came a shocking, gut-wrenching realization, one that reverberated through his very core. The tragic story unfolding through the voices, the themes of love, betrayal, and loss, mirrored with an unnerving precision aspects of Elias's own buried trauma, the silent void left by the loss of his loved one. The apartment was not merely revealing its past, it was holding a spectral mirror to his own. The echoes were not just of strangers, but of a pain he knew intimately, a wound that had never truly healed. The apartment, in its relentless playback, was forcing him to confront not just the ghosts of its former occupants, but the specters of his own past. The spectral mirror held by the apartment reflected Elias's own torment with brutal clarity, deepening his identification with the voices. His obsession with the apartment's past intensified, consuming him entirely. Days bled into nights. His once meticulous work as a sound engineer lay neglected, and his personal life, already threadbare, withered further into non-existence. He ate only when hunger became unbearable, slept only when exhaustion dragged him down, his mind a perpetual echo chamber of the apartment's history and his own. His past tragedy, the agonizing loss of his loved one, resurfaced with an overwhelming, almost suffocating force. He found himself projecting his own guilt and grief onto the characters in the recordings, their despair becoming his, their sorrow a direct conduit to his own buried pain. The young couple's doomed romance felt like a twisted reflection of his own lost happiness, their suffering a perverse validation of his unceasing desolation. The apartment's echoes, once distinct narratives, began to blend seamlessly with his own internal monologue, creating a cacophony of sound that blurred the lines between the apartment's history and his personal anguish. He was no longer merely listening. He was reliving, experiencing the emotional trauma of generations as if it were his own. In a moment of desperate seeking, driven by an almost supernatural instinct, Elias discovered a hidden compartment. It was concealed behind a loose panel in the grand fireplace, a subtle imperfection he had previously overlooked. Inside, nestled amongst dust and cobwebs, lay a collection of old, brittle letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small, leather-bound diary. The diary, he soon realized, belonged to the young woman from the recordings, the one whose melancholic voice had first drawn him into this spectral world. He carefully opened the diary, its pages smelling faintly of lavender and forgotten dreams. The entries provided a chillingly intimate window into the emotional turmoil and despair that had gripped her in the days leading up to the tragedy. Her elegant script detailed a love that had soured, a growing sense of dread, and a suffocating loneliness. She wrote of whispered arguments, of betrayal that cut deeper than any blade, and of a pervasive fear that had settled into the very bones of the apartment. Elias read of her growing suspicion of the mysterious visitor, his manipulative words, and the increasing distance from her beloved, whose loyalty seemed to waver under external pressures. Through her words, he realized the apartment was not merely recording sounds, but the very emotional residue of its inhabitants. It was a repository of their hopes, their fears, their love, and their ultimate despair. The air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of her sorrow as he absorbed each entry, each revelation. A sense of dread, cold and pervasive, tightened its grip on Elias as he approached the critical point in the recordings, the moment of ultimate catastrophe. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the diary would soon reveal the missing pieces of the puzzle, the truth that the muffled recordings had denied him. Then a cryptic entry, scrawled in hurried, desperate handwriting, appeared on a yellowed page. It hinted at a deliberate act, a planned deception, rather than an accident. "He knows," she had written, "and he will make us pay. This is not how it was meant to be, but his hand guides the fate of us all." The revelation struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. The past tragedy, the one he had assumed was the unfortunate culmination of a doomed romance, was not as it seemed. It involved a deeper layer of deception, a calculated malice that transcended mere circumstance. Someone had orchestrated their demise, weaving a web of betrayal that led directly to the apartment's terrible secret. The echoes were not just of sorrow, but of injustice. Elias, his hands trembling slightly, traced the desperate words in the diary. The cryptic entry, "He knows, and he will make us pay. This is not how it was meant to be, but his hand guides the fate of us all," solidified the horrifying truth. The tragedy was no accident. He meticulously cross-referenced this revelation with the fragmented recordings, the muffled arguments, the sudden violent crash. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity, forming a mosaic of betrayal and calculated malice. The young couple, caught in a web of love and financial despair, had become victims of a brutal act orchestrated by another. The identity of the perpetrator, initially a shadowy figure, began to emerge from the subtle nuances in the voices. The stern landlord's pronouncements had always carried an undercurrent of avarice, his demands for payment laced with thinly veiled threats. But it was the mysterious visitor, whose presence had grown increasingly ominous in the recordings, who now stood revealed as the true architect of their downfall. His voice, once merely manipulative, now sounded cold, calculating, devoid of empathy. He had exploited their vulnerabilities, their desperate love, and their precarious financial situation for his own gain, ultimately leading them to their tragic end. A powerful surge of anger, cold and righteous, washed over Elias. It was not just the anger of an observer, but the fury of someone who felt the injustice deeply, personally. He felt an overwhelming desire for justice for the long-dead victims, whose cries for help had been silenced by time and the apartment's walls. The apartment's recordings became more vivid, almost as if he was no longer just listening, but witnessing the events firsthand. He saw the glint of malice in the visitor's eyes, heard the chilling finality in his tone, felt the terror that must have gripped the young couple in their last moments. The apartment, once a mere recorder, transformed into a terrifying, visceral theater of memory. Driven by this surge of indignation, Elias delved deeper, seeking any overlooked detail. He found a crucial piece of evidence, one that must have been missed or deliberately ignored by authorities in the past. Tucked within the diary, a small, faded newspaper clipping detailed the disappearance of a wealthy relative of the young woman, a relative whose inheritance would have solved all their financial woes. The date of the disappearance coincided eerily with the visitor's increased presence and the young couple's escalating despair. The recordings, when re-examined through this lens, hinted at the visitor's involvement in the relative's demise, clearing the path for his own nefarious scheme. This was not just betrayal, it was a carefully plotted crime. The recordings chillingly indicated that the perpetrator, the mysterious visitor, had escaped justice entirely. He had vanished after the tragedy, leaving no trace, and seemingly lived a long, unpunished life, his hands stained with the blood of innocence. Elias's personal grief, the raw wound of his own lost loved one, merged seamlessly with this historical injustice. The apartment's echoes, once a source of shared sorrow, now fueled his drive for resolution, a desperate need to retrospectively right a wrong that had festered for decades. He was no longer merely a listener. He was an avenger, a conduit for the silent cries of the past. His fingers, still tracing the faint impressions in the hidden compartment, brushed against something cold and metallic. He carefully retrieved it, a small antique pistol, intricately engraved, its metal dulled by time. Its presence confirmed what the diary and recordings had hinted at. This was no spontaneous act of violence, but a premeditated murder. The weapon, a silent testament to the brutality, solidified the perpetrator's cold calculation. It was a stark, tangible piece of the puzzle, a physical anchor to the spectral horror he had uncovered. A final, chilling realization solidified in Elias's mind, tightening the knot of dread in his stomach. The perpetrator, the mysterious visitor, was not an outsider. Through cross-referencing names mentioned in the diary and the faint whispers in the recordings, Elias understood. The visitor had been someone closely connected to the victims, a trusted confidant, perhaps even a relative, making the betrayal even more profound, more insidious. The true horror lay not just in the act, but in the intimate deception that preceded it, a betrayal that tore at the very fabric of trust and love. The apartment had borne witness to a crime of the heart, a wound inflicted by those closest, leaving an indelible scar on its very essence. Elias, propelled by an unyielding need for truth that transcended the boundaries of time, began his relentless search for the descendants of the past residents. The names, once mere whispers from the antique tapes, now felt like a sacred trust. He spent weeks poring over dusty archives, cross-referencing genealogies and navigating the labyrinthine paths of public records. His quest led him to a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighboring town, to a modest house where an elderly individual, a distant relative of the perpetrator, was said to reside. This was the final thread, the direct link to the injustice that had festered for decades within the apartment's walls. The confrontation was fraught with an almost palpable tension. The elderly individual, a woman named Eleanor, her eyes clouded with age but sharp with suspicion, initially dismissed Elias's claims as the fanciful ramblings of an eccentric. "Family history is best left undisturbed, young man," she had stated, her voice brittle. But Elias, Armed with the meticulously catalogued fragments of the recordings, the damning entries from the diary, and the chilling presence of the antique pistol, was unyielding. He presented the evidence not with accusation, but with a quiet, unwavering conviction that spoke of profound understanding. He played the muffled arguments, the desperate pleas, the visitor's cold, calculating voice. He recounted the diary entries, the hidden compartment, the newspaper clipping that tied the perpetrator to the wealthy relative's disappearance. Eleanor listened, her composure slowly crumbling under the weight of the undeniable truth. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the unacknowledged secrets of generations. The past, once a distant, abstract concept, now sat between them, solid and inescapable. She began to speak, her voice trembling, revealing old family secrets, long-held resentments that had shadowed her lineage like a curse. The perpetrator, her great-uncle, had been a notorious black sheep, a man whose charm masked a ruthless ambition. The family had always suspected his involvement in the young couple's disappearance, but fear and a desperate need to protect their name had forced them into a pact of silence. As Eleanor spoke, Elias experienced a profound breakthrough in understanding his own past trauma. The apartment's story, a tapestry woven with betrayal, loss, and the devastating silence that followed, mirrored the gaping wound in his own soul. He saw the parallels in the denial, the unspoken grief, the suffocating weight of an unresolved past. The relentless pursuit of justice for the long-dead victims was not merely an act of historical rectification. It was, he realized, a crucial step on the path to his own healing. By giving voice to their silenced cries, he was, in a way, reclaiming his own. A moment of deep emotional catharsis washed over both of them. Eleanor, her eyes brimming with tears, finally broke down, confessing the ancestral knowledge she had carried, the whispers of guilt and complicity that had haunted her family for decades. The truth, once a carefully guarded secret, was finally acknowledged, breaking decades of silence. Elias felt a profound sense of vindication, a quiet triumph for the forgotten. Yet, it was also accompanied by the heavy weight of the enduring pain, the irreversible tragedy that had stained the apartment's history. The apartment's voices, which had once been a source of torment, a cacophony of sorrow and injustice, now seemed to offer a different resonance. They no longer screamed of unanswered questions, but whispered of closure, of a story finally heard, a wrong finally acknowledged. The echoes, though still melancholic, carried a newfound sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that the long vigil was nearing its end. Elias knew his journey was not yet complete, but the heaviest burden had been lifted. The path forward, though still shadowed by grief, was now illuminated by the gentle light of truth. Elias, having meticulously brought the long-buried truth to light, finally found a profound measure of peace. The tumult of the apartment's past, once a deafening roar in his soul, had softened into a gentle hum of understanding. He knew his work was not merely to uncover a historical crime, but to honor the memory of those whose lives had been tragically cut short, ensuring their story, so long silenced, would at last be heard. This newfound purpose, a commitment to remembrance, became his guiding star. He dedicated himself to creating a public exhibition of the apartment's unique recordings. With his unparalleled sound engineering skills, he painstakingly restored and curated the fragments of conversations, the faint cries, the very breath of those who had once inhabited the space. He designed an immersive experience, a sanctuary where visitors could don headphones and step back in time, listening to the echoes of love, tension, and ultimate betrayal. The exhibition was housed in a modest gallery, transformed into a solemn testament to the lives lived within those walls, a memorial to forgotten tragedies. It wasn't just a display, it was a conversation across centuries, a bridge between the living and the long-departed. As the exhibition opened, drawing quiet crowds and respectful attention, Elias felt a profound shift within himself. No longer haunted by the specter of his own loss, nor by the unquiet spirits of the apartment, he began, slowly but surely, to rebuild his own life. The lessons learned from the echoes, the stark realities of betrayal and the enduring power of truth, had reshaped his perspective. He understood now that healing was not about forgetting, but about acknowledging, honoring, and moving forward with wisdom gained. He found a new, compelling purpose in preserving forgotten histories, in giving voice to the voiceless, whether they were the victims of past injustices or the untold stories of everyday lives. His work expanded beyond the singular apartment, venturing into other historical sites, each with its own silent narratives waiting to be unearthed. The apartment, once a place of dread and an amplifier for his personal grief, had truly transformed into a space of remembrance and ultimately healing. It stood as a silent sentinel, its walls still bearing the imprints of the past, but now infused with a sense of reconciliation. Elias's own journey of forgiveness and redemption, a path he hadn't known he was on, reached its quiet completion. He had wrestled with his own past, the haunting loss of his loved one, and through the apartment's story, he had found a way to integrate that grief, to understand it as part of the larger human tapestry of sorrow and resilience. He had made peace with his own past, no longer allowing it to define his present or dictate his future. One crisp autumn morning, Elias stood in the now empty apartment, a sense of profound closure settling over him. He had meticulously packed away his equipment, the antique devices now reverently preserved, and was ready to leave. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, creating a serene, almost ethereal glow. The apartment no longer felt heavy with sorrow. Instead, it resonated with a quiet dignity, a sense of having fulfilled its purpose. As he turned to depart, his hand on the doorknob, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed against his ear. It was soft, loving, a familiar melancholic tone, yet imbued with a newfound serenity. It was the young woman's voice, the one that had first drawn him into this intricate web of the past. It was a farewell, a gentle acknowledgement, and a promise of enduring memory. Elias smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, and stepped out, closing the door behind him. The echoes of its stories, and his own, would continue to resonate, not as burdens, but as testaments to the enduring power of truth, empathy, and the quiet, persistent hope for a future healed.